Today we're going to be handling the rest of our axle upgrades. What's going on, everyone? We're back with the Axial Bomber. This is episode 5 of this series where I'm trying to convert this new Axial Bomber into my ultimate bomber setup. This is the most recent release from Axial, the 2020 version, kind of an upgraded version or updated version from the original. Very little was really changed in the end, and from what we have now, almost none of that remains. So no matter if you've got an older bomber or the most current one, all of this will apply still. But what we're going to jump in today is I'm going to finish the rest of the axle upgrades, both front and rear, including completely relocating our servo up front, as well as changing up some suspension geometry. Let's start with the rear of the buggy first. My goal for this episode was to install a new Vanquish Stage One Kit. The Stage One Kit from Vanquish includes a set of front knuckles, front C-hubs, and a set of rear clamping lockouts for the AR60 axles. These offer a little bit of a different design from the stock version, where these don't just rely on the 2 screws, one on the top, one on the bottom, to retain the lockout onto the axle. These are obviously made from aluminum and they slide over the housing just like your stock version. However, that clamping feature in the back just helps to hold these more secure onto the axle housing. This just helps to eliminate any slop that could happen where you have 2 pieces that are designed to slide over each other. One thing to note is that I do find it best to move the clamping function to the back side of the axle. Being that there does have to be a small separation for the pieces to clamp together, if you move them to the front side, where you may think that they look a little cleaner or a little bit more out of the way, one thing that can happen is the front tires can shoot debris basically right back into there, and it can find their way through that path and in the long run find its way down into the axle housings. Move it to the back side and you'll help keep debris out of your axle the best as possible. Now, while I was working on the rear axle though, we weren't just going to install a set of lockouts. I also had a brand new set of the new VXD rear axle shafts from Vanquish as well. Now, previously we installed the VXD front axle shafts, and these rear axle shafts offer some very similar upgrades. The biggest upgrade that I would say is the strength of the outer stub axle. When you compare the 6mm stub axle to the standard 5mm stub axle, it's a huge upgrade in strength. If you look visually, 1mm may not seem all that large, but it really is. The outer threaded portion of the axle also goes from an M4 to an M5. So again, just 1mm larger, but it really adds a lot of strength with that increased diameter, as the outer diameter is really where you find the strength of an axle shaft like this. In addition to the strength there, the axle shaft thickness itself between the inner and the outer portion is also larger than the stock shafts, and the inner part that goes into the center locker is of a different design. This again uses that square drive tang rather than the more flat-sided tang that the stock axle uses. Overall, it just keeps increasing the strength throughout this system to try and give you the strongest axle that you can get to drop into a housing like this. To accept the tang for those axle shafts, we did again have to change out the inner locker that was included with the VXD rear axle package, and at that time, just like the front, we decided to throw an Incision gear set in the rear to add a machined rear gear set. Again, one more thing to beef up the overall strength of these axles. A quick tip, when you're installing these, you will need to pull out one of the 2 link mount screws to try and slide everything through there easily. That's a pretty simple one, pretty standard on almost any of the axle shafts, even the stock ones. However, the tip is actually that when you're putting it back in, do not over tighten these 2 screws on either side. If you over tighten those, what will happen is you'll really stress the plastic through that area of the axle housing, and you always see breakage right through those points. And generally with plastic housings, when those points break, 9 times out of 10, it's from people who have over tightened those screws and then continue to put, a beading on their axle. But if you don't over tighten the screws in those locations, you'll make those stock housings last a lot longer. After getting all of those parts installed inside of the axle, the new rear axle shafts do come with new aluminum outer hexes as well, just one more bonus. And then bolting the wheels and tires on, you will need an 8mm nut driver again for these rear axles, but now we'll use the same nut driver for both the front and rear axles. So you'll only need one, even if it is that thin wall 8mm driver that is needed. But the upgrades that we've done to this rear axle now should really make this a super solid setup. There's not much left on this axle to upgrade other than the housing itself. We could replace the trusses and the outer link mounts, but that's about all that's left. For now, I'm gonna stay with plastic housings on this truck, try and keep it a little bit lighter, but those other parts we may replace down the road. But moving to the front axle now. Up front, we completed the installation of that Stage 1 kit, including the black aluminum C-hubs and the black aluminum knuckles. The knuckle design in the Stage 1 kit is different than the stock knuckle that comes on the Bomber. It's a high steer design that moves the steering arm up, which was helpful for what we're trying to accomplish here, because the other thing that we did was that we installed this high altitude performance front servo mount. This mount takes the servo from on top of the axle and moves it behind and rotates it also. Now this kit, just like the rear back half and the transmission, doesn't come with any instructions. So you are gonna have to kind of find your way through this itself. That's one thing that could definitely be improved. A nice set of instructions is always appreciated, especially when you're looking at just a non-replacement part style item where you just have to, you don't exactly know which way things are supposed to go. But we were able to figure it out. It wasn't too difficult, but it did take a little bit of fiddling. The servo mounting plate is carbon fiber. It attaches to the center of the pumpkin and then through the outside screw hole where the outer mount of the truss would go. There's two spacers that get stacked on that outside, and then one screw goes through that down into the axle housing. The servo simply drops down into the bracket, and then you'll screw it all together. I drilled out the holes on mine to an 1/8 inch so I could use a pass-through screw with a lock nut on the back. I'm not sure if that was the intended use, but an M3 screw didn't want to pass right through. So thinking that some people are trying to thread them in, for me, I decided to drill it and then use lock nuts. The output of the servo I put towards the front side of the servo mount, and then I used a 24mm Vanquish servo horn pointing straight forward. On a previous video, we had installed the Incision tie rod and drag link included with the link kit that we had on here. Currently, that is still installed here. One thing to note though is that currently my drag link is touching the servo mount when I try and go hard driver's side. That's one thing that I think maybe would help from a slight bend in this drag link, or possibly adding a little bit more of a spacer on the passenger side. I'd like to avoid adding spacers if possible. It's just something that increases leverage, has a much higher chance of bending a screw or bending a knuckle arm. So we're gonna try to avoid that. I may add a slight bend, see if that clears, and then if not, we'll make a final decision how we want to handle that a little bit later down the road. During this whole process, I've also decided to replace the servo, obviously. And for this project, what I grabbed was a Tekin T360 servo to drop in here. I've used one of those servos for quite a while in my 1.9 trucks, had really good luck with it. This will be the first time that I'm trying to use it in a more heavy and more powerful 2.2 truck. So we'll see how it holds up to that type of abuse. Previously, the upper links mounted to the axle truss that was installed on here, but this servo mount completely gets rid of that axle truss. So we now needed a new place to relocate those upper links to. But of course, the high altitude servo mount has the mounts integrated into it, but they are not compatible with the factory length links that we had previously replaced. So what I had to do was dig through my link box to find some links that would work to get the approximate pinion angle that I needed. And what I ended up going with was a pair of 107mm links. That's total length of the link. The eye-to-eye distance for those links would probably be closer to 122mm. Now currently everything fits, clears well, my pinion angle looks good, but the bigger problem is that the backside of that servo mount is very close to that Tekin Rock 412 HD motor that we previously installed. I don't think that I would actually be able to clear the sensor wire through the suspension travel. So there's a couple of things that we can do. One is that I can take the motor, and if I rotate it to move the sensor wire port to the very top side, the travel of this axle shouldn't get up to that level. So if I was able to do that and get the sensor wire moved out of the way and secured into place, I think that I would be all right. However, that would rotate where my actual motor wires are to the bottom side, which I'm not super keen on. The second option is more involved, but after talking with Jake Wright, who is one that has had a lot of success racing these bombers, he was talking about something that helps the overall performance of the bomber, especially with the performance upgrades that we've already done to the rear of it. Now, that rear suspension is said to really kick this bomber up a notch, but to make the front try and work as well as the rear does, it helps to extend that front wheelbase a little bit. And now that we've moved the servo out of the way, I'm not really worried about any clearance issues under the nose of this bomber. So what I can do is I can move to changing out all of the front links to extend the front wheelbase, maybe up as far as 10 millimeters total. Not sure if I'll go all of that distance or not yet, but it's something that we're probably going to investigate, most likely on the next episode. Moving the front axle forward would allow us to get a little bit more angle out of our shocks, allow us a little bit more suspension travel overall that way, and then we can tune our shocks to help control that. These Proline ProSpec shocks that we previously installed are more than capable of taming this type of truck. But that will pretty much do it for the upgrades in this episode. Again, we're really getting into there. We're changing out a lot of parts. I'm going to be changing out parts that I already changed out just to tweak and move this thing even further. But it's just kind of the nature of what I'm trying to achieve here. I really want this truck to be capable of outperforming any driving skill that I may have. And I think we're on our way to making that possible. So far, I think we've done pretty good at trying to keep things subtle appearance-wise. All the aluminum that we added this week, we went with black, so it just kind of blends in. You may not even notice it right away. We do have the blue parts on the shocks now, and now we definitely see those red Tekin items shining from the bottom. I thought about changing up the look on the panels of this, but I don't know. I think I'm kind of liking leaving it with that factory paint scheme, even though it will be far from factory, well, even now. Should we change it up, but stay with something dark and subtle and kind of just underneath the radar? Or do we go super flashy like most of my stuff normally is? Drop what you think in the comments below. Hope you guys are enjoying the bomber content. It's definitely been a lot of fun and a vehicle that gets passed over way too often for how much fun you can have with this. Again, if you like the videos, make sure to hit the like button before you leave. Subscribe if you're not already. Hit the notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. Once again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.